Welcome back to the Book of Storyteller Secrets, the podcast where I talk about how to be a better writer. So today, I do want to talk about something that I've been calling demon in a bottle syndrome for a few years now. And the reason that I'm calling it that will make sense in a minute. But the short version is this. It's the compulsion to keep going, to keep escalating, to keep rewriting, to keep reinventing, to keep making things bigger and more dramatic and more complex. Because somewhere along the way, you internalize the idea that more is better and that standing still is the same thing as failing. Okay? And this is one of those problems that sounds like it actually shouldn't be a problem, because on the surface, what I'm actually describing sounds like ambition, right? It sounds like someone who cares about their work, someone who's always pushing, who's trying to improve, who's always reaching for the next level. And those are all good things, okay? Nobody's going to tell you that caring about your craft is a bad thing. But, and this is a big but, there's a difference between improving your work and being unable to stop touching it. Okay, there's a difference between raising the stakes because the story demands it and raising the stakes because you don't know what else to do. And there is actually a very specific, very common failure mode where a writer's inability to just leave things alone, their need to always go bigger, always change something, always reinvent what they've already built, that actively destroys the thing that they're trying to make better. And that is what I'm calling demon in a bottle syndrome. And I am going to get into where that name comes from and why this happens and what it looks like in practice and why it's actually so hard to catch yourself doing it. Because the thing about this problem is that it actually feels like work. It feels like you're being productive because you're writing. You're changing things, you're making decisions, and the whole time, you're actually making your story worse. So, where does this name actually come from? So, Demon in a Bottle is a very famous Iron Man comic from 1979. And I do want to be clear about something because there's actually a lot of revisionist history around this. The story arc that people associate with the name Demon in a Bottle was later named after this one issue, but Demon in a Bottle itself is only the last issue in that arc. It's one comic, and in that one comic, Tony Stark develops alcoholism, deals with alcoholism, and overcomes alcoholism, all in one issue. And somehow, this changed the character of Iron Man forever. Now, the thing to remember is that when they did this, that was not the intention. Okay, nobody sat down and said, we're going to redefine Iron Man forever. The writer and the artist, Bob Layton, actually said, and I quote, I'm quoting David Michelin here, that it was never our intention to do anything relevant. We were paid to, basically, do the next episode of Iron Man. That particular issue, alcoholism was the bad guy. Instead of Dr. Doom or somebody like that, it was the bottle. That was our villain of the month. And that's really the way we treated it. We built everything up to that. But the point of it is, we never attempted to be relevant. End quote. And that matters because they weren't trying to make a statement. Okay, they weren't trying to change the trajectory of a character who had existed for over a decade at that point. They wrote a story where the villain was alcoholism instead of a guy in a suit, and it landed so hard that it became the defining moment of the character. Okay, not because they engineered it to be, because the story worked, and the audience responded to it, and then once the audience responds like that, you can't exactly just put it back in the box. But here's where the problem starts. Because what happened next is that other writers looked at Demon in a Bottle, and they said, hey, I want to do that. I want to write the issue that changes everything. I want my story to be the one that redefines the character forever, and it becomes the new status quo that people will talk about 40 years later. And as a result, they started trying to do intentionally what Layton did basically by accident. And as a result, since that comic, you can actually see this happening everywhere. Again, especially in comics, but not only in comics, right? Every new arc has to change the world forever. Every event has to redefine the character forevermore. Every storyline has to fundamentally alter everything that the reader thought that they knew. Nothing is ever allowed to just be a story anymore, because everything has to be the story. The one that matters, the one that changes things for all time. And this actually has a direct effect on you, the person who is currently sitting at home writing your own stuff in your own world. Because what this mentality is, when you strip it down, is a fear of the status quo. Okay, it's a fear of stagnation. It's the idea that if things aren't changing, if the ground isn't shifting, if you're not blowing something up and rebuilding it, then the story must be boring. That standing still is the same thing as being dead. And that fear is where demon in a bottle syndrome lives. It's the thing that makes writers reinvent the wheel over and over again. Okay? They rewrite their magic system for the third time. They kill a character and bring them back different. They tear down the political structure that they just spent 6 chapters building because they got bored with it, or because they thought that the reader would get bored with it. Okay? They change the rules, they change the world, they change the characters. They keep changing, keep escalating, keep going bigger. Because if you stop, if you let things sit, then maybe people will lose interest. And the result is that nothing means anything. Okay, the characters stop being characters because a character requires some degree of consistency to function as a person that the reader can invest in. Okay, the world stops being a world because a world that reshapes itself every 50 pages isn't a place. Okay, it's a kaleidoscope. The reader can't get their footing. Okay, they can't care about the kingdom that's going to be overthrown next chapter. They can't invest in the relationship that's going to be rewritten by the next arc. They learn very quickly that nothing they're being shown is permanent. And the moment that lesson lands, the story is dead. Because why would you care about something that the writer is going to take away from you the moment they get restless? And here's the thing. Too much stasis is in fact bad for a story. That's absolutely true. A story where nothing changes and nothing is challenged and everything stays exactly where it started is boring. That's true. Nobody is arguing for that. But you do need something to hold still. You need a foundation that the reader can stand on while interesting stuff happens around it. Okay, you need parts of your world and your characters that remain consistent, that the reader can trust, so that when something does change, it actually means something. Now, I did mention comics, but this isn't a comics problem specifically. This actually happens across all mediums and all genres, and it is worth looking at where these things show up elsewhere, because the pattern is actually the same even when the surface looks different. In fact, soap operas are probably the most obvious example. Every episode of a soap opera has like a dozen twists in it. Characters are revealed to have, long-lost evil twins. Secret relationships just materialize with people who were introduced in that same episode. Somebody will die and then come back to life. Somebody who was a villain is now somehow sympathetic. Somebody who was trustworthy is now scheming against everybody. The logic is flexible to the point of it's decorative, essentially, because the show isn't actually operating on logic, it's operating on emotional cues. So the question isn't, does this make sense? The question is, does this make you feel something right now in this moment before the commercial break? And in fact, in that context, it works. Soap operas have run for decades doing exactly this, because that's exactly what the audience signed up for. Okay, they know what they're getting. The constant upheaval is the product. But trying to sit down and write that as fiction in a book is nearly impossible, because a book asks the reader to hold the whole thing in their head at once. Okay, a book asks for investment over hours, over days, over weeks, in fact. And if nothing the reader invested in last chapter is still true this chapter, then the reader stops investing in it. A soap opera can get away with this because the audience tunes in tomorrow regardless. A book just doesn't get that grace. Or, in fact, take manga or anime, where you can actually watch this happen in slow motion over the course of an entire series. Because every new arc has to be bigger than the last one. right? The villain has to be stronger, the stakes have to be even higher, the power has to escalate. And yeah, it starts out fine. The first arc is often grounded, and the characters have limits, and the fights feel dangerous because the reader believes these people can actually lose, but then the next arc raises the ceiling, and the one after that raises it again, and by the end of the series, the characters are fighting gods because the writer has escalated so far and so consistently that there's literally nothing else left, right? They have gone so far off the rails that the only thing that can possibly challenge their characters is the fabric of reality itself. And at that point, those aren't characters anymore. They're power levels with names attached to them. Right? The person who started the story as a kid with a dream and something to prove is now punching holes in dimensions, and the reader can't remember why they cared about any of this in the first place, because the thing that they cared about got escalated out of existence. So, the most famous example of this is probably Dragon Ball Z, and it is worth walking through because you can actually watch the syndrome take hold in real time. So, for example, in the first arc, Goku dies fighting his brother. That matters a lot. It's a big moment. The strongest character that the audience knows gets killed, and it costs something, right? The story moves forward from that loss. Now later, he has a climactic fight with Frieza, and he becomes a Super Saiyan, and when that happens, it lands. And it lands because the show has spent time establishing that this is a legendary transformation, something that's extremely rare, something that has not happened in 1,000 years. The audience feels the weight of it, because the story told them that this was significant, and then it delivered on that significance in a moment of genuine desperation and grief. But that arc also planted the seeds of what would nearly destroy the series, in my opinion, which is power levels. And if you saw my episode on why your world building sounds like an RPG, you already know where this is going, because I actually talked about exactly this, which is the moment that you assign a numerical value to strength, you've now created a treadmill, because every new villain has to have a bigger number. Every new transformation has to push the number higher. And very quickly, the numbers stop meaning anything, because the audience has no frame of reference for what the difference between 10,000 and a million actually looks like in practice. It's just bigger. It's always bigger. The number goes up, and that's supposed to be enough. But it actually gets worse than that, because the thing that made Goku's Super Saiyan moment land, the thing that the show spent all of that time building up as a rare and legendary thing, and it's so special to him, turns out to be something that any Saiyan can do. It's not a once-in-a-millennium event. It's just a thing their species is capable of if they get angry enough. Vegeta does it. Hell, Gohan does it. Trunks does it. A transformation that was presented as extraordinary becomes ordinary. And once it's ordinary, it can't carry a moment anymore. So what do they do about it, right? They add a 2 to it. So now there's Super Saiyan 2, and then Super Saiyan 3, and then 4, and then they circle back around, and they create Super Saiyan God Super Saiyan, which sounds stupid on its face, because it is stupid on its face. It's a name that exists because the escalation ran out of room, and had to start stacking words on top of each other to pretend that there was still somewhere for them to go. And the thing is, by that point, the characters are literally fighting gods, right? They're fighting for the survival of entire universes because the series has simply run out of things to do. It has escalated past every villain, past every threat, past every meaningful challenge. And the only thing left is the biggest possible thing, which is everything itself. And when the stakes are everything, the stakes are nothing. Because the audience knows it's not going to end, right? The universe is not going to be destroyed. Goku is going to win, because he always wins. The question was never whether or not he'd win. The question used to be, what would it cost him? And the show stopped being able to answer that a very long time ago. That said, anime is actually really bad about this in general. For example, Naruto starts with an outcast orphan boy who wants to be respected by his village, and that is a very grounded human want. A kid who has nothing and wants to belong somewhere. But 700 chapters later, he's fighting an alien moon goddess as a reincarnated ninja Jesus figure, right? That's where the escalation took him. from a lonely kid who wanted friends to a literal demigod battling cosmic entities. And somewhere in those 700 chapters, the thing that made the audience care about him in the first place got buried under so many power-ups and prophecies and Chosen One reveals that it actually stopped being the story. And also, this is not limited to anime or comics, right? Look at movies. The Marvel Cinematic Universe built a whole lot of time and effort towards Thanos snapping away half of all life in the universe, and they pulled it off. That worked as a culmination of over a decade of films, as the thing that everyone, and everything had been building towards. But now they actually have to top that, and half the universe died, and the audience watched the heroes undo that, and now someone has to sit in a room and they have to figure out what comes after that. What's bigger than half of everything? And the answer is that nothing really is, which means you're either telling a smaller story, which is going to feel like a step backward to an audience that has been conditioned to expect escalation, or you're trying to manufacture stakes that are somehow larger than the destruction of half of all life, which is, quite frankly, absurd on its face. Now, that said, television might actually suffer from this worse than anything else, because the structure of television demands it. Okay, every season needs a hook, right? Every finale needs to be bigger than the last one. The show has to justify its own continuation, and the easiest way to do that is to raise the stakes, which means that every season is louder and more dramatic and more world-ending than the one before it, until the show itself collapses under the weight of its own escalation. A clean example of this is going to be Sherlock, all right? The show builds to Sherlock Holmes defeating Moriarty, right? That's the peak. That's the thing that the character was built to do. The adversary he was defined against, the confrontation that the audience was waiting for. And then it happens. And then there's another season. And the show has nothing to do at all. Because how exactly do you follow that? The answer? You can't. Because you've already used the biggest thing that you had. Whatever comes next is going to feel smaller by comparison, and the audience is going to feel it, and the writers are going to feel the audience feeling it, and they're going to overcompensate by making the next threat even more convoluted and even more personal and even more impossible. And the show is going to eat itself, which is exactly what happened to it. So, I hope by now that you can clearly see the problem that I'm articulating. And in fact, you're probably thinking of other series that have this exact issue, or maybe in fact you're looking at your own writing and you're realizing that you yourself have done this, right? You've escalated past the point where the escalation means anything. You've torn something down and you've rebuilt it because you were afraid of standing still. Now, does that mean that it's unavoidable? No, it's not. And the way that you prevent it from actually happening is by understanding what your story actually is and what matters when it comes to writing conflict, and how to avoid ending up in a doom loop where nothing you do lands because nothing you've done before it was allowed to stick around long enough to actually matter. So here's a question for you. What exactly is your story? Now, I don't mean who's in it, and I don't mean where it takes place. I mean, what is the story you are telling? Now, if you haven't watched my first video on dialectics, this would be a good time to go do that, because the framework that I laid out there is going to be useful here. But the short version is this. Lord of the Rings is the story of Frodo taking the ring to a volcano to save the world. Okay? Harry Potter is about a boy discovering his destiny and defeating the Dark Wizard who killed his parents. Okay? Star Wars is about Luke Skywalker embracing his destiny and overcoming his opposite, the Dark Lord of the Sith. Now, these are vague, and they are meant to be vague. Okay, you have your thesis and you have your antithesis, which is the character and the thing that opposes them, the want and the obstacle. And the reason that I am keeping it vague here is because this is the ceiling. Okay, this is going to be the peak of your story, and it's the thing that cannot be surpassed while you are telling your story. So during the course of Lord of the Rings, you cannot have a bigger, more dangerous version of Sauron appear and get defeated halfway through, right? Harry Potter cannot fight a more powerful Voldemort in Book 4 and win, because then Book 7 doesn't matter. Okay, if there's a stronger Sith Lord standing behind Palpatine, then Luke's victory at the end of Return of the Jedi means nothing. The audience watched him overcome the ultimate evil, and you're telling them that it wasn't actually ultimate, that there was a bigger one the whole time. In fact, you've retroactively hollowed out the moment that they invested in. But, more importantly, knowing what your story is going to give you the thing that keeps you from reinventing the wheel. Because you know where your character needs to be at the end when that final conflict happens. And that means you can't just reshape them every time you get nervous. You can't tear down the world and rebuild it because you're bored, or you're scared, or you're convinced that the reader needs something new. Because if you do that, your ending won't work. The final confrontation, whatever that happens to be, requires everything before it to have been building towards that. And if you've been rearranging the pieces this whole time, nothing is going to be where it needs to be when you actually get there. So take, for example, Avatar: The Last Airbender, right? The characters develop over the course of the series, and that's good. That's what a story is supposed to do. But notice what the show doesn't do, okay? It doesn't keep blowing up its own foundations. The conflicts in the show are mostly internal, okay? The growth is personal. And when the show does expand what bending can do, it's specific. It's used to demonstrate that a particular person is uniquely talented, right? Toph can bend metal. Nobody else can. That's hers. That's her thing. Azula can throw lightning. That's rare, and it's tied to who she is as a character. And Aang's special ability, the thing that the whole show is built around, is that he can bend all four elements. That's unique to him. That's the premise of the show. And so the journey that he takes is learning how to do that, learning each element one at a time in a way that coincides with him growing as a person. The bending is the mechanism, but the story is about a 12-year-old kid who ran away from his responsibilities, and now he has to face them. Okay, the mastery of the elements tracks with his maturity. They're the same arc. But just imagine if the writers had gotten scared. Imagine if halfway through the series, someone in the room said Aang isn't special enough, bending isn't interesting enough, we need to add something, and suddenly Aang can bend wood. Or maybe somebody introduces a fifth element that nobody mentioned before, or the character starts showing up who can, also bend all four elements, and now Aang isn't unique anymore. He's just one of several people who can do the thing that the show told you only he can do. All right? The whole world starts to fall apart. Every choice that the show made up to that point gets undermined because the rules that those choices were built on aren't the rules anymore. The audience invested in a story where mastering four elements was the peak, where that was enough, where the journey to get there was the point. And now you're telling them that it wasn't enough, that there's more, that the thing that they are watching the character work towards was actually just the baseline. The story is that Aang masters all four elements to end a 100-year war that he ran away from. If you then go, actually, there are more elements, the gravitas of that whole journey is just gone. The destination that the audience was walking towards with him just move, and they can feel it, and they will stop walking. And just incidentally, this is also why it's really hard to keep a series running forever, because the urge to keep showing more, to keep revealing more, to keep expanding the lore, will eventually undermine the story that you're telling. Because stories do require a beginning, a middle, and an end. That's what makes a story different from annals. Okay, you're not just recounting events, you're structuring them into a narrative. And a narrative, by definition, has a shape. It goes somewhere, it arrives, and then it's done. The moment you try to keep going past that arrival point, you're fighting the structure of what a story is, and the longer you fight it, the more damage you're going to do to everything that came before it. But now that we've established that you can't just keep inventing new powers and new revelations and radical changes to your world every 5 minutes, we do have a practical question to answer, okay? What do you actually fill your story with? right? What do you write between the beginning and that climax that feels impactful, that feels important, that keeps the reader engaged without overshadowing the ending that you're trying to build towards? Because that's the fear, right? That's where this syndrome comes from. The writer is sitting there with 200 pages between the opening and the finale, and they're terrified that the middle isn't enough, that the reader is going to get bored, that if they don't blow something up, or reveal something massive, or fundamentally change the rules, that the audience is going to leave. And here, again, is where dialectics are going to be useful to you, because you can create moments that carry far more weight than their actual impact on the world. You don't need to kill characters. You don't need to shatter the reader's understanding of how things work. You don't need to add new powers or introduce a secret villain or restructure your magic system. What you need to do is make it matter to the characters. So, for example, let's go back to some of our previous examples that we've talked about. Why exactly does the death of Obi-Wan matter? Okay? Why does Luke being told that Darth Vader is his father matter? Because it matters to Luke. Okay, these are big, they're important, they're emotional moments for him as a person. They reshape how he sees himself and the world that he's in. But they are not bigger than his eventual clash with Palpatine. They don't overshadow the ending, they build towards it. Okay, the audience feels the weight of those moments because they understand what they mean to Luke. And that understanding is what carries the story forward without the writers needing to introduce a second Death Star halfway through Empire Strikes Back just to keep things interesting. Or let's use a slightly inverse example, where we look at how stakes are raised for the villain. Okay? In Harry Potter, how do we know that Voldemort returning is such a big deal? Now, it's not just that we're told that he was a terrible person, and it's not just that people won't speak his name, and it's not just that he killed Harry's parents. The question I asked isn't whether Voldemort is bad. The question I asked is, how do we know that his return is as catastrophic as the story needs it to be? And the answer to that question is what we see he's willing to do when he's barely alive. So in the first book, he's a spirit just clinging to the back of Quirrell's head. He's drinking unicorn blood to sustain himself. He's at his absolute weakest. And yet, he is still committing acts that are so vile that the story treats them as almost unspeakable. He shows you, the reader, in that state, that there is no act that's beneath him if it means his survival. Now, in the second book, we discover the things that he left behind, like his journal. Now, we don't know what it is yet, not really, but we do know that it's evil and that it drives the entire plot, and through it, we learn that he was doing things like this when he was still a student. Okay, he was already this person as a teenager. Now, in the third book, we discover how he corrupted people that Harry's parents trusted. Okay, people who were supposed to be safe, and that corruption is what led to their deaths. Okay, we see the reach that he had even before his fall. And that means that by the fourth book, when he does return, we've had 3 books of context. 3 books of dealing with his weakened self, his younger self, and then the lingering consequences of the last time he walked the earth at full power. So the audience has spent 3 books watching the damage he can do when he's a ghost, when he's a memory, when he's just a shadow of a person. And now he's back, in a body, with a wand, and the reader doesn't need to be told that this is bad. They know it's bad. They've been watching the evidence accumulate for 3 books now. And the important thing to remember here is that the climaxes of what came before don't overshadow that moment. Okay, they're what give it weight. Each one was in fact important. Each one mattered. And none of them actually needed to be bigger than what was coming because they weren't trying to be. They were building the foundation that the return stands on. And this is what makes dialectics so useful for proper storytelling, because it ensures that every clash, every moment, produces a consequence, and that the consequence matters. The consequence doesn't have to be big, it just has to mean something. So, for example, when Obi-Wan and Darth Vader face off, the synthesis is that Obi-Wan dies. And what that costs Luke isn't physical. He doesn't lose a battle, he doesn't lose territory, he loses a mentor figure. He's the last person that he knew from his old life on Tatooine. Everybody else from that world is already gone. His aunt and his uncle are dead. And now, the man who connected him to his father, who gave him a lightsaber, who told him that there was something bigger out there waiting for him, that person is gone too. Luke isn't wounded, he's unmoored. The person who was guiding him through all of this is no longer there to guide him, and he has to figure out the rest of it on his own. Now later, when he loses his hand fighting Vader, that's a problem, but he recovers from it, right? He gets a new hand. The story moves on from that fact. The more consequential development, the actual synthesis of that confrontation, is that his worldview is just shattered. Vader is revealed to be his father. This great enemy, this symbol of everything the rebellion is fighting against, is the person who made him. He isn't separate from this conflict. He's at the center of it in a way that he never wanted to be. And that gives him a crisis of confidence that carries into the next film. He doesn't come out of that confrontation with new abilities or a power boost. He comes out of it unsure of who he is. But also, notice what didn't happen. Okay, nobody gave Luke new powers. Nobody changed how the Force works. Nobody revealed a secret history that restructured the galaxy. Obi-Wan dying doesn't alter the political landscape. Luke being Vader's son doesn't change a single thing about how the war is going. The rebellion is in the same position that it was before. The Empire is also in the same position that it was before. The galaxy itself didn't move an inch. But those moments are two of the most important scenes in the entire franchise. They carry enormous weight. They define the characters. They drive everything that follows them. And they did it without touching the world at all. They only touched Luke. So what I'm trying to nail down here in your mind is that the weight of events is not tied to the size of their repercussions. You do not need to radically alter the characters or the world forever in order for something to matter. You do not need to blow up a city or introduce a new power or kill half of your cast to make the reader feel something. Because often, the smallest things carry the most weight. A piece of information that changes how a character sees themselves, or a loss that isn't strategic but personal. A moment where nothing in the world changes except the person who is standing in the middle of it. Or let's use Avatar again, because it's a great show and it has lots of good moments like this. What, for example, is the moment that the story gains proper weight? Okay? When does it stop being a fun adventure show about kids traveling the world, and when does it start being something that actually matters? Because it isn't anything that's happening to the world. It's actually the discovery of what has already happened. So Aang brings Katara and Sokka to the Air Temple, which is his home. That's the place he grew up, and it's destroyed. Everyone he knew is gone. And then he finds the skeleton of Monk Gyatso, his father figure, the person who raised him. And Aang loses it, because in that moment, the full weight of what has happened lands on him. He ran away. He was supposed to be there. He was the Avatar, and he left. And while he was gone, his entire people were wiped out. And the person who loved him the most died alone in a war that Aang wasn't there to fight. And the thing is, he's 12. He's a child carrying the knowledge that his choices, a child's choices, had consequences that destroyed everything he knew. That isn't fair. It was never gonna be fair. And it's his anyway. That scene doesn't change anything about the world. The audience already knew that the air nomads were gone. They already knew that there was a war. They already knew that Aang was the last airbender. The scene doesn't reveal new information about the plot. It doesn't restructure the conflict. It doesn't give Aang new abilities, though the Avatar state does activate, yes, but he doesn't do anything with it here, so it's not functioning as a power upgrade. It's functioning as a boy's grief being so overwhelming that it triggers something that he can't control. What I'm getting at is that the world did not change. Okay, our understanding of who Aang is didn't need to be radically reinvented. The show didn't need to add a new villain. It didn't need to add a new threat or a new twist that recontextualizes everything. All it needed was the emotional beat to land. And the emotional beat was as simple as a boy finds out that his father figure is dead and that it was his fault and he can't undo it. That's all it took. And it's one of the most powerful scenes in the entire series because of it. And again, this is all dialectical. Aang's desire to be carefree, to avoid confronting the fact that actions have consequences, is opposed by the reality that he cannot move through the world without running into them. The thesis is a kid who wants to be a kid. The antithesis is a world that will not let him do that. And the synthesis is that moment at the air temple. The realization, the grief, the understanding that he can't go back and he can't undo it and he has to carry it forward. It produces something, it changes him, and the story moves on from it with a different Aang than the one who walked in. But it did not require a radical shift in the world. It did not require a huge alteration of the character or their abilities. It didn't change everything forever. It required the writer to think in terms of impact, not in terms of scope. And here is where I need you to be careful, because the seeds of demon in a bottle syndrome can be sown here too if you don't realize it. Now, if you feel like you need to keep hitting these beats, if you try to give Aang that moment of grief and helplessness and overwhelming realization every single chapter, it's not going to work. If you try to do the Obi-Wan death scene every chapter, it's also not going to work. These moments land because they're rare. They land because the story gave the audience time to breathe between them, time to settle into a new normal before the next thing disrupts it. The weight exists because there's space around it. If you keep trying to replicate that weight, you will feel each one getting weaker than the one before it. And you will panic, and that panic is where the syndrome kicks in, because the instinct when an emotional beat doesn't land as hard as the previous one is to try to go bigger, make it louder, make it more dramatic, kill more people, destroy more things. And now you're on the treadmill. So think about it this way. The Death Star blows up Alderaan. Okay, that's a really big moment. An entire planet is just gone. And the audience feels it because it's singular. It happens one time. And the story treats it as monstrous, and the weight of it carries through the rest of the film. But if the Death Star blew up 50 planets and we watched each one of them, every single one would hit softer than the last, because by the 10th one, the audience is numb. And by the 20th, they're bored, and now the writer is stuck because the only tool they have is destruction, and destruction has stopped working. And so the only option left is to destroy something bigger. And that's how you ruin the impact and how you ruin the story. So this is similar to what I talked about in my episode on not writing an RPG again. And over-reliance on scale and on scope and on numbers means that none of it actually means anything. And the drive behind it comes from the same place as demon in a bottle syndrome, which is the fear that if you're not always changing everything, if you're not always ensuring that nothing will ever be the same, you're not writing a story. And that's just not true. Because the story lives in the moments between the emotional beats. That's what allows those beats to work. The quiet parts aren't filler. They aren't dead space that you need to get through so that you can reach the next big scene. They're the thing that gives the big scene all of its power. The reason that Obi-Wan's death carries weight is because we've spent time with him before it happens, right? We've watched him talk to Luke on Tatooine. We've seen him in the cantina. We've been in the room while he explains things. And he tells half-truths and, guides this kid towards something bigger. Those moments weren't really spectacular, right? Nobody would put them on a highlight reel. But they were important because they built the relationship that makes the death mean something. The reason why Aang finding Monk Gyatso's skeleton hits as hard as it does is because we've been with him while he was being a kid, right? We've watched him ride penguins and goof off and avoid responsibility and laugh at things that aren't funny. Those scenes existed so that the audience could know who this person is when he's happy. So that way, when the happiness gets taken away, the audience can feel the distance between where he was and where he is now. Those moments of him goofing off mattered. They did real structural work in the narrative, even though nothing was happening in them. Especially because nothing was happening in them. If every scene that you write is an event, if every chapter changes the world, if the story never lets the reader sit with the characters when things are calm, then the emotional beats have absolutely nothing to push against. They're just another loud moment in a series of loud moments, and the reader is going to stop flinching, because they've learned that this is just what the story does. It's always like this. There's always a crisis, there's always a revelation, and if there's always a revelation, then none of them are revelations. They're just more noise. And that is enough for today. What I want you to take away from this is that you need to resist the urge to constantly upend the status quo. Because if you do it often enough, chaos itself becomes the status quo. And chaos as a default is not interesting. It's exhausting. It's numbing, in fact. In trying to make everything constantly dramatic, you've actually made everything the same because there's no variation to it. There's no contrast. If every moment is turned up to 10, it means nothing is turned up to 10, because 10 is just where you live now. A moment can only land if it has something to land against. The impact of a change can only be felt or measured by how much or how little has changed before it. If the ground is always shifting, the reader can't feel the earthquake. If everything is always on fire, they can't feel the heat anymore. So know what your story is. Know where your story ends. Know what your ceiling looks like, and don't blow past it halfway through because you got scared. Let your characters sit in the quiet. Let the world hold still long enough for the reader to care about it. And when the moment comes, when the emotional beat arrives, when the thing that matters finally happens, trust that you've earned it. Trust that the stillness did its job. Trust that less, deployed at the right time, in the right place, for the right character, will always hit harder than more will.